Radio IKIM Inspirasi Utama Anda. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And very good afternoon to the dear listeners of IKIM FM. Welcome to the special interview. I'm your host, Batrisha Afrina. And inshallah, for the next 25 minutes, we will listen to a story from a person that I believe is going to give an inspiring story on things that is happening between the Palestine and also Israel. So I welcome to the studio with me, James Godfrey. Hi, James.
Hi, Patricia.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
And how do you feel so far in Malaysia?
I'm really loving Malaysia. Some incredible people and places, culture and buildings and food and stories galore.
So you really like here in Malaysia?
Mm-hmm.
Alhamdulillah, it's such a pleasure to have you here in the studio with us today, James. So, James, our listeners might be wondering, who are you and what we're talking about for today? So just a little bit of background of James Godfrey. He is a member of Freedom Flotilla Coalition, and he is also the media committee, also director of engagement and research for our race. And of course, for today, there are lots of questions that we can ask about him, because for today it is a two-part series of interview, which with the topic Amplifying Voices for Palestine. So James, before we go into the conversation itself, perhaps could you first introduce a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, briefly, because I'm keen to amplify the voices of Palestinians. But to contextualize it, I was brought up in London in a liberal Jewish community. My ancestors, they fled from European racism, Judeophobia, otherwise known as anti-Semitism. They left what's now called Russia and Eastern Europe in the late 1890s, and they fled to London. They came there prior to the Refugee Convention of the 1950s, but they arrived in London escaping persecution. So my upbringing was in a liberal Jewish community, and I observed the racism against Jewish people, which was apparent in London at the time, but it was at a relatively low level. I didn't experience any violence of any types. It was mainly comments and attitudes. But at the same time as this, I was experiencing other types of racism, I was observing other types of racism. And my friends who were brown or black, Asian or African Caribbean at the time, and communities I was around, I saw real racism at work, real deep hatred and violence against people. And then I also saw in my community a racism from some people within the community I was living amongst against these same people. And so there was a lot of confusion as a child, seeing this playing out with these different types of racist attitudes. And there seemed to be some sort of hierarchies. And I was slowly working that out as a young person.
So this was during 60s, 70s?
No, this was during the 1970s.
1970s.
Yeah. And at that stage, there was no mention of Palestine at all. There was talk about Israel. There was talk about trees being planted to make the desert bloom, some of these stories which are talked about. But there was an invisibility of Palestine and Palestinians. It was a blank canvas upon which Jewish people were making a wonderful place to live. Stories of kibbutzes, and it was very peculiar to gradually find out more about the racism which there was around the world, and slowly to understand, hold on, there's something happening here. Where is this Israel being built? Upon whose land is it being created?
And talking about it, you mentioned about, your childhood. So you didn't receive any direct attack or I would say direct action of anti-Semitic, but you did receive some comments, right? So but before we go into that, could you picture to us your childhood? How is it like to be brought up by I would say, liberal Jewish family?
So weekly there would be religious ceremonies. So on a Friday evening there would be some bread, the challah, there would be some candles which would be lit, and there would normally be some meal. Chicken soup is a traditional sort of Western European, brought from Eastern European thing which is done amongst Jewish families. Often a roast dinner, depending upon how much money we had at the time. and there would be visits to the synagogue on a weekly basis, and I'd participate in Sunday school activities and be learning Hebrew. And learning stories. And around festival times, there would be special ways in which the synagogue would be decorated, and I'd be helping out with various things, including pouring out the small bits of wine or helping cut the bread. And of course, as a small child, it was very exciting with all this action happening, and I might perhaps try a small bit of the wine and sneak a little bit of bread or some of the cakes happening. And there would be a hall, and there would be some chairs you'd be putting out. So this was happening amidst other religious activities. You'd see the Torah scrolls, there'd be books, prayer books and things. It was before computers, really, and there was no internet or phones. So there'd be things typed, and you'd be producing and sharing and handing things out to visitors, to congregants at the synagogue. But it was liberal in the sense that we drove a car to get to the synagogue, and family members ate foods which they shouldn't eat some of the time. Although we did frequent a kosher butcher regularly for small amounts of meat, which we ate because meat was quite expensive. So we didn't eat a large amount of meats at all. But we did do that. But not all of the food we ate was kosher. So it was liberal in that sense, which maybe is unusual for the audience. But that's there are many different strands of Judaism and liberal Judaism. There are many strands and many beliefs within that. It's not an homogenous group of people or homogenous religion. There are people who think and do many different things. It's a belief. It's not something that's transferred through your DNA, even though some people who believe in Judaism or who say they are Jewish say that it is transmitted from a mother to their child. But I think this is not possible. This defies my knowledge of genetics, which is limited, but I think sufficient.
So, from your liberal Jewish upbringing, how do you think that it influenced your worldview and also motivation, especially when we talk in the context of social justice and also activism?
Well, I was brought up, there were a lot of readings which we had in the synagogue, but also at home and amongst family, of what was right, what was proper, that if things were unfair, people talked about these stories of Jewish people in bondage and servitude and cruelty, and plagues and famines and people being killed. There's a lot of brutality in some of the Jewish religious stories. And the underdog, David, taking on and defeating Goliath, and the horns and Jericho, and many things in these places which are Palestine. So there were many of these inspirational stories which you heard of underdogs and oppression, and they stuck with me. But at the same time, I was getting conflicting narratives from one of the Sunday school teachers was a former Israeli soldier. His name was Uri, U-R-I. And he was a horrible person. And he just oozed nastiness and evil, and it was just horrid and was so mean, particularly if you said something which wasn't right. And when I picked up, I went, hold on, there's some racism happening here. Some anti-Black racism, anti-African racism. I think it was around the time of the hijacking of an aircraft which landed in Uganda at Entebbe, and Israeli special forces raided the aircraft, killed many of the hostages, the people who were hijackers. But it was in an African country, and there was a lot of anti-African racism, which came from this man and from others. And it was in that really cemented some of my, hold on a second, what's happening here? And so this led quite rapidly, as I developed in my early teens, living in the heart of the belly of the beast of imperialism. That's not USA, but Britain. It's about Britain. We're in Malaysia, and British imperialism. And it was live and direct in the Malvinas, in the Falklands, the Argentinian, the war against Argentina in the early 1980s. And so my political consciousness was rising. There were massive uprising on the streets of Britain in this time, people may recall, against the racist police in particular, and the policing of communities, Black people and Asian people in their communities, and also the rise of extreme right-wing political organizations like the National Front. And I got involved in a variety of local politics, Labour, left-wing sort of politics, and went to some demonstrations, ended up being beaten up severely by the British police, quite a few of them, and British soldiers. And I was bloodied and educated. And from that day forward, I'm here today, decades later. From there, it was a rapid increase in my awareness, and I became involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and the campaigns to challenge British support for South African apartheid. It seemed a natural thing for me to be involved with the injustices there. And I helped organise the permanent protest outside the South African embassy in London, which lasted for 4 years.
4 years.
It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no sitting down, no lying down. It was permanent in the middle of London, Trafalgar Square. And I developed a lot of connections, a lot of awareness, appreciation for other people's sufferings, and for the conduct of the British government, and my responsibility as someone who lived in a place where this government was doing these particular things. And so the responsibility to act in a situation-dependent manner. My situation was in London, so I was acting because I was living in London, the British government, and my acknowledgement, acceptance that people would respond in different ways depending upon their situations. And so for instance, the South African people living under apartheid, it wasn't our job in London to be telling them how to conduct their struggle for their rights. It was up to us to get out of the way of them attaining their rights. And so this is where I began and developed my understanding of what solidarity meant, as opposed to charity.
So it seems like your activism started as your motivation towards the anti-Black racism, as you mentioned just now. You protested in front of the embassy, right? The Uganda embassy, if I'm not mistaken, just now.
No, the South African
the
embassy.
South African embassy. So, starting from that, how does it shift into the activism towards the Palestinians?
So I became aware of issues all around the world, and Palestine was one of them. Far from the only one, but the British occupation of Ireland, the French bombing of islands in the Pacific Ocean, Mururoa, the many different topics around the world and histories I became aware of, and Palestine was one of them. And there were people who spoke about it, and I participated in a range of demonstrations in support of Palestinian rights. But I developed and became more and more involved in Palestinian solidarity. I moved to Australia several decades ago from London. I was involved in anti-apartheid work, supporting the South African people's rights. I was involved in campaigns in support of the people of Timor-Leste, the people of Bougainville, who are still seeking their independence from Papua New Guinea, the former Australian colony, and many other campaigns. But in 2010, some years after the Israelis had increased their blockade of Gaza, I became more involved. Now, the Gaza Strip has been occupied by the Israelis since the Israeli state was established in 1948 during the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians from their lands.
Yes.
As 750,000 people, as your listeners would know, were expelled by the Zionists before establishing Israel. 90% of the population living in the Gaza Strip now are refugees. There are people forced from their homes into a small strip of land. There are now well over 2 million people living there. And a blockade was established, limits, restrictions on people coming and going, items coming in and out, has been in place for decades. But it became particularly bad, much worse, following the elections in 2006, which Hamas won, which the West didn't like the result of an election, and the Israelis imposed a much harsher blockade. There were several boats, which I wasn't aware of at the time, who had successfully challenged the blockade, small boats, as part of the Free Gaza movement. And they very successfully sailed in and out 5 times into the port of Gaza and back again. And an attempt was made in 2010 to sail a large amount of people with a large amount of aid to break the blockade. And this was organized out of Turkey, where there was the IHH organization, humanitarian organization, got a large ship, which was called the Mavi Marmara, and out of several other ports in the Mediterranean, where there were other boats transporting other peoples and other cargo, they joined together and they sailed to break the blockade. So my involvement in this was someone who bought some bags of cement online and shared the stories. And to that extent, I was a participant on land. I was traveling in Africa at the time, doing some voluntary work in Cape Town. And on 31st of May 2010, the Israeli military attacked the Mavi Marmara and they murdered 10 people, one who died later in a coma several years later. Hundreds of people were brutalized, arrested. All of the boats were attacked. All of the people were detained. People were tasered, strip searched. They had their possessions stolen from them, and they were eventually deported. And I got very annoyed about this. And I contacted the relevant Australian ministers at the time, got inadequate responses. And a Palestinian friend of mine, sometime later that year, who lived near to me, said, James, we're doing some more things within Australia to get a group of people together to help organize to get Australians onto the next boats which will sail. We're not stopping now. We need to go again. Do you want to be part of this group? So I began being part of this group. It's now 13 years ago, and I've been a part of Free Gaza Australia since then.
So I'm sure you have a lot of things to share with us, James, but we will go for a short break, and once we come back later, we will listen more from James Godfrey. So dear listeners, don't forget to check out our social media pages, facebook.com/ikimfm, and also through our youtube.com/@ikimfm_my. So we'll go for a short break, and once we come back later, we will listen more. So don't change the radio station. Stay tuned to Ikim FM, Inspirasi Utama Anda. Assalamualaikum. Welcome back. Just now, before we go for a break, we listened to sharing from James Godfrey, who is the member of Freedom Flotilla Coalition. He's the media committee and also the director engagement and research of our race. So just now, James, before we went for a break, we talked about your experience bringing up in a liberal Jewish family, and then you even talk about how you started getting involved in activism. So just now you mentioned about your activism and kind of like a demonstration, and then you even involved in, for example, like Timor-Leste and also for the South Africa, and how it eventually involved into your involvement for the Palestinians. Now, just now I also mentioned about your involvement in the Freedom Flotilla. So perhaps could you explain in details what is that organization and what is its primary objectives?
Yeah, the Freedom Flotilla Coalition is an organization which has no head office, but we are an organization consisting of many different parts all around the world. And we have partner organizations of different sizes, different dimensions in different areas. Our local partner here in Malaysia, which is why I'm here with you today, I believe, is MyCare, MyCare. So MyCare, a huge humanitarian organization which works in many different parts of the world, providing humanitarian relief and solidarity to peoples who are struggling in various circumstances in a variety of situations, be they human-made or natural disasters. In other parts of the world, we work with organizations who are campaigning for particular things in particular places. We work with people in Norway and Sweden. I mentioned earlier IHH in Turkey. We have people in Aotearoa, an organization in the USA, in Canada, in many parts of the world, and in South Africa too. So it's lots of people in larger and smaller organizations who've come together for the activity of challenging the Israeli illegal maritime blockade of Gaza. And that's our mission. There are other people involved in other important work, which is around boycotts and divestments and sanctions, BDS movement, and locally you have BDS Malaysia, for instance.
Yes.
But we're involved principally in challenging the maritime blockade. And so we want to inform people about it, expose it, and physically challenge it. And so we sail boats regularly. We procure vessels of different sizes, and we stop, often publicly. We try to be very public and have rallies, manifestations in different ports. And we bring awareness as the situation in Gaza as we sail towards Palestine from national waters of a particular place we're leaving. Say, for instance, we're leaving Greece, we'll be in Greek waters, we then go to international waters, and then we go into Palestinian waters. One of the problems we have is that once we are becoming closer to Palestinian waters, the Israeli occupation forces, who act with impunity, believe it's their right to attack us. This unarmed, non-violent boats sailing with human love and solidarity and humanitarian aid, they attack us routinely and have done so repeatedly since 2010. And this, of course, though, is the experience of Palestinians, very differently, though, as fishing off the coast of Gaza, and they are routinely attacked by the Israeli occupation forces. So our organization brings people together who want to do something on the water. But not everyone can be on the water, so we need participants not only on board the boats, we need participants on the land. So the Freedom Flotilla sails, and as we say, when international law fails or when governments fail, we sail. Now, your government's not failing, it's challenging the Israeli government and the occupation, absolutely. So for us and other organizations in the Western world or the North, the global North, even though we're in the Southern Hemisphere in Australia, we sail because our government is failing. And so we've sailed on lots of different occasions with a variety of boats. Some are converted fishing boats, some are yachts, and with people from all around the world, from all walks of life, different demographics, ages, backgrounds. And we bring this diversity of peoples and experiences onto our boats to spread the awareness of what's happening in Palestine. And there are people on the ground who regularly, after the boats are attacked, they keep saying, we want you to keep coming. So we respond to the calls from Palestine. So in that sense, we feel we're acting in solidarity rather than charity. And as one Palestinian said to me a few years ago, James, when you bring your bodies and put them on the line, you become part of our struggle. And that's when solidarity transforms into being part of the struggle. Because for us, our liberation is tied to Palestinian liberation. As a person brought up in Judaism, as a person living on stolen lands in so-called settler colonial Australia, my liberation is tied with Palestinian liberation. And I will never be truly free until First Nations people in the continent of Australia are free and Palestinian people are free.
So talking about it, that's very interesting, the concept of challenging physically the Israeli maritime blockade. And talking about that, so these boats are not big boats.
Well, in the past, we've sailed fairly small boats, and our current mission, we have two missions on the water at the moment. One is titled For the Children of Gaza, and the boat is called Handala, named after the cartoon character of Najal Ali's, the 10-year-old boy who will only be able to turn once he is able to return to Palestine. And this is a small fishing boat. It holds around 15 to 20 people. There are, I think, 2 Malaysians currently on board, and there are Malaysians on board regularly. It's been traveling from Norway, and it's on its way to Gaza. Currently, it's just arrived in Spain, I believe, in Santander. So people can check that out on the MyCare Instagram page. And so this is a smallish fishing boat. We're picking up in each of the ports we go to items which the Israeli government has banned. For instance, maternity kits, nail clippers, water purification tablets, crutches. And we are packing smallish quantities of these, token items of the quantities of these, to demonstrate the outrageous inhumanity, illegality of the Israeli regime and the governments of the world that support it. So this is a small boat. And in the past, we have sailed small boats of a varying types of boats. And interesting for another time, the information is on the Freedom Flotilla.org website under About Us, previous missions. People should look there for the rich histories. But at the moment, we also have 3 large ships. This is new. This is an emergency mission. We call it Break the Siege. And we have 3 large ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they are preparing to sail with thousands of tons of humanitarian aid, with hundreds of people from tens of countries all around the world. And they're preparing to sail next month to Gaza to break the siege. So this is stepping it up, because this has to be the last mission to break the siege. There is a crisis, there is an emergency which we have never seen before in Palestine. This is it, people. We don't want to be on this radio station next year talking about a mission to break the siege of Gaza. It has to happen now. And so to that extent, there are, I believe, around 20 people from Malaysia who will be on board these large ships. 2 of them are cruise ships, and one of them is a huge container ship, which is capable of carrying 5,500 tons of humanitarian aid. I've seen the warehouses. They are burgeoning. They are full of humanitarian aid, of generators, of dried food supplies, of bedding, of clothing, of medical equipment, and they're ready to go. And the only thing that's stopping them are administrative, bureaucratic, legal obstacles, which the Israeli government and its supporters around the world put in our way. And we will not be deterred. We've been delayed for sure. But we will not be deterred, and we will be sailing very soon to challenge this illegal blockade.
So previously in the several voyages before, are there any successful attempts?
Every single boat that has attempted to break the blockade of Gaza has been attacked in international waters since 2008. No boats have reached there. And in fact, prior to those few small boats from Free Gaza movement in 2007, 2008, no boats had reached Gaza since 1967. This is the only closed port in the Mediterranean. What is happening? And yet the Israelis think that they can rock up to Paris 2024 and participate in sailing events, that they have maritime freedom of movement on their windsurfers and their canoes or whatever they're on in Paris. No, there should be no freedom of movement for the Israelis, or there's no freedom of movement for the Palestinians.
And talking about that, can you specify, because you keep mentioning about the being attacked by the Israeli forces, can you specify the kind of attack that being received?
The way they attack, they attack. They turn the lights out. They turn the power off. They appear on the horizon with massive military force, with drones, with warships, with Zodiacs, with their guns, and they attack our boats in different ways, depending upon the size of the boat, exactly the time of night or the weather. There's variations, but they attack. They come on with massive quantities of guns. The only weapons that are ever on our boats are Israeli weapons. And they use overwhelming force to take over in acts of piracy in international waters our boats. And depending upon what type of levels of resistance to piracy we put up, they may exert greater degrees of violence. People are routinely tasered and beaten. People have guns pointed at their heads. The red dots are lighted up on people's bodies as targets, and people are threatened with execution. I know it sounds routine the way I'm describing it, but that's what happened. And since 2010, they haven't killed any of us on our boats, whereas they've killed many, many Palestinian fishers. And so our passports of privilege provide us with some degree of protection. And so it's really important that Westerners, but not just Westerners, people from all around the world, whose passports encourage their governments to help protect them, that serves as a way of protecting Palestinians who try and ply a living fishing off the coasts of Palestine. But yeah, that's what happened. They steal our things, they lock people up, they steal people's Bibles, they attack and remove people's communications equipment. They cut all comms channels, because when you're about to commit a crime, you don't want anyone to be a witness to it. But there are witnesses, there are living witnesses. People are detained and eventually deported. But this is happening But we have a physical blockade, but also an information blockade.
Mhm.
And we have our people on the ground, our partners on the ground. We Are Not Numbers and the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. They're working under a genocide at the moment,
Yes.
attempted extermination.
Yes.
And then just overnight, a My Care employee who is in charge of videography, Anas Mohammed, was murdered by Israel. And I'm waiting to see what the response of the global community is to this latest journalist who's been murdered. Our partners are in mourning, but I know that they'll be mobilizing in memory of Anas's family, and the community he's from in Gaza. And the information blockade that the Israelis put around Gaza, around Palestine, where they target journalists, they destroy internet connectivity, they have their talking points, their propaganda, their hasbara, which is echoed and amplified by countries and media organizations around the world, particularly in Australia, is what we need to challenge as organizations, but also for your listeners, people listening today, as individuals, how we can break this information blockade of what's happening in Gaza and support Palestinian people and amplify their voices.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you look on the social media, right, you can see it raised in the people sharing information or even some postings about things that are happening in Gaza, in Rafah, for example. And we see this being raised, this I would say this raised from the especially from the younger generation. And now that we are living in an interconnected world where media travel faster than what we could talk of. And thinking about that, overcoming the information blockade, how can we break that blockade imposed by the Israeli government?
I think it's really important that people consider who they are and where they operate and to work in their lanes. If you're a cyclist, you might be looking at cycle lanes. If you're walking, you might be more interested in walking lanes. But depending on who your community is, your family, your workplace, your networks, what influence can you create within those areas? Often the powers that be, not the powers that will be, but the powers that currently are, want you to think it's too difficult. They want you to think it's too complicated. You need to be an expert. No. We believe in human rights for everybody, and people need to step back and resist this demand that they be an expert before they talk, and they need to speak from their heart, and they need to speak to the people who they know in their immediate circles, but also to people who don't know anything. Because when you talk to people who don't know anything about Palestine or have never studied very much, but don't have particularly strong feelings, and you talk to them in the language of what's happening, and you share Palestinian people's stories, Palestinian journalists' stories, Palestinian organization stories, lawyers' stories, you share this, you go, whoa, this is what's happening. These are compelling stories, and they drive people to action and away from inaction, and the people then want to do something. So I urge people to break the information blockade by working in the zone in which they're comfortable. And for those who are comfortable to do it, move just a little bit outside your comfort zone and speak up a little bit more. And if everyone speaks up a little bit more, don't assume that somebody else is writing to your pension fund or to your employer or whatever it is, or to an international organization and say, I would like this done, please. And we should never underestimate the power of one phone call, one email, one handwritten letter, a visit to an office. These are very powerful tools which people can deploy.
So, with that being said, I would like to thank James Godfrey for his insight on the first part of today's conversation, amplifying voices for Palestine. So, be sure to tune in to us next week to tuning for the part 2. So, stay tuned to IKIM FM, Inspirasi